There you go.
Super. Okay, well, thank you very much, Anton, and good evening, everybody. It's really great to be here, and it's just really great that Rabbis for Human Rights are organizing these training sessions. It's really so useful, I think, to bring lots of different angles of the current situation on the ground in the West Bank to volunteers and organizations that are going to be on the ground. So that's really, really, really super to be here. And I hope that this is useful. We're really keen for it to be a very interactive session. So the idea is that I'll just give a kind of overview to start with, looking at probably some of the things that Liam was talking about, but bringing them in, as Anton said, into a more sort of field specific context. And then Ammar will give a presentation about some of the statistics, and compare last year to the year before and various kind of olive harvest and settler violence elements. And then what we'd really be keen for is to have as long as possible to hear from you, to hear questions or reflections or any type of input, really, to really, just to really engage on these important questions. So please do, once we finish the two short presentations, please do feel free to interact as much as possible. Ammar, I wonder if you could put the slides up.
Okay.
And if we just flip back to the first slide, that would be super. And then the second one, please. Thank you. So yeah, really what I wanted to do was, first of all, just introduce, I'm not sure how much experience and exposure everybody's had. So to start with, I will briefly just explain the system. So in the case of the West Bank and Gaza, including East Jerusalem, of course, the humanitarian response follows the international model of response when humanitarian intervention is required. And that means that all different organizations working on the humanitarian front are organized in a cluster system. And this is really just a way to organize all the very many different organizations and ensure that we're working to common goals and for the benefit of the population. So the cluster system has an area so the protection cluster, which is where we are, which in this case is 150 or so different organizations as the partners in the cluster. It also has a WASH cluster, so that focuses on water and sanitation needs in the occupied Palestinian territory. And we also have a shelter cluster and what other clusters? Education cluster. So all the different organizations that have expert areas are organized into this cluster system, as I say, to support, coordinated humanitarian work. The protection cluster in the case of Palestine is far and away the biggest cluster in this context, with 150 or so partners. So there's a team of us, the Protection Cluster Coordination Team, that work to support the partners to have both the overview of best practice globally, but also to coordinate on the ground and ensure a good coverage of response, and that we are focusing on the protection needs as they emerge. So that's broadly the cluster system. The way that protection responses work on the ground here is that they're split up broadly into two different parts. We have preventative protection, so protection work which aims to stop violence or displacement or demolition or other types of humanitarian impact or human rights violation. And then we have the remedial. So we have a whole section of activities and projects that focus on reducing the risk of violence and other violations. And then we have a whole section of activities that work to mitigate the impact. So once a violation has taken place, the protection response there. Now, where you guys come in on the absolutely essential role of protective presence is, of course, part of the preventative side of the protection response in Palestine. So we call it proactive protection, which I'm sure some of you will have heard already from Liam, who's really a kind of global leader on these on proactive protection. And the way that proactive protection works here in the context of the West Bank is that it has 4 key cornerstones. And protective presence, which you guys will be providing or thinking about providing through rabbis and other organizations active on the ground, is one of those cornerstones. Ammar, could we move to the next slide, please? Thank you. So this is really just a way of visualizing the cornerstones. We have in the center monitoring, reporting, and analysis, and many of the partners who work on both the preventative and the remedial side of protection are actively on the ground documenting and reporting human rights violations as they take place on the ground. We have many partners who are well experienced in this field, and good monitoring, reporting, and analysis forms the absolute bedrock of all protection work. So the reporting and analysis informs the programmatic response. And this is that, so here we have in this picture, we have the 4 cornerstones of proactive protection. And you can see in the bottom left, is that what is my left? The protective presence function. The other 3 preventative tools that we use largely here in the West Bank are community self-protection. So that means supporting communities of Palestinians on the ground to become more resilient in the threat of violence, really celebrating and enhancing their own, of course, inherent self-protection mechanisms. We have civil military coordination, so humanitarian dialogue on protection, so engagement with the Israeli authorities, both IDF and COGAT, on rights violations and protection concerns. And then finally, protection advocacy. And this is, of course, ensuring that protection concerns are delivered both privately and publicly in private and public advocacy. So these 4 sets of activities have many different projects attached to them, and they need to work in harmony to give the population, and in this case the Palestinians, a chance of feeling better protected in advance of violence happening or as violence is happening. There we are, thank you. So I think what's important here, before we look at the bigger picture, but we'll keep this slide, is to just think that, you guys, we're focusing right now, of course, on the olive harvest. And in the protection cluster, part of our role is to monitor and report on the landscape, the protection landscape in the West Bank, since here we're focusing on the West Bank. And of course, as we all know, the situation has escalated to an extent where the environment is volatile and much more intense than it has been in the last couple of decades in terms of the threat of violence and real violence on the ground. Now, in this case, those 4 cornerstones of proactive protection can be applied across the population that are at risk. In this case, we're talking about the farming population, the agricultural sector. We also recognize as another vulnerable population, the Bedouin and herding population. So we have the 4 vulnerable populations. We have the agricultural farmers in the frontline villages, as we call them. We have the Bedouin and herders who live largely in Area C, which is the 62% of the West Bank under Israeli military and administrative control. And then we have the refugee camp residents, or in and around refugee camps. And the fourth vulnerable group is the residents of H2 and East Jerusalem, who have a very specific kind of urban type of vulnerability. Now, the way that we apply those four cornerstones, as you can imagine, would be rather different for each population. You know, providing protective presence in the context of a refugee camp might look rather different to providing protective presence as you will be, or some of you will be, or you're considering to be in the agricultural areas. So you can imagine, as our job, we propose models of how to adapt these different cornerstones to create activities that would serve the different populations effectively with their own needs and the different risks that they face. As you know, if you are living in a tent in a Bedouin community and you're vulnerable to demolition, it's very different from if you're living in a house in a refugee camp where you may be vulnerable to, aerial bombing. So the situations and the needs are different, and we are part of designing the models to best address the protection risks and the protection needs of the population. So the second part of our role, as well as coordinating our partners and really kind of enhancing the expertise of our partners, is to always bring all of us back to the bigger picture. As in most conflict areas, the protection cluster is led by UNHCR, so the High Commission for Refugees. In the case of Palestine, the position sits with OHCHR, which is the human rights part of the UN system. And that is because what it means is that we have two hats. We have the human rights international humanitarian law hat, and then we have the cluster, the partner coordination hat. And I think that in that role is very useful here, because we can refer to our human rights hats and constantly bring us all back in terms of messaging and understanding of the context to the bigger picture. For the olive harvest, for example, which Ammar will shortly talk you through, let's remember, as we think about the farmers on the ground, that the building of the barrier which prevents their access to 9.4% of the West Bank, where it is built on Palestinian land, is illegal according to international law. The highest court of the UN, the International Court of Justice, ruled on that in 2004, which I'm sure you're all very aware of. So constantly coming back to the broader messaging is a very important part of our role, is reminding people of the principled approach. Again, what we see here, by restricting access of Palestinians to their land, by systematically not controlling or reducing the threat or actual settler violence, the result is that Palestinians leave their land. They are forcibly displaced, whether that's Bedouin and herders from their rangeland and their communities, or in this case, farmers from their olive groves. And the result of that, the empty land, is clearly part of the land annexation enterprise that is ongoing, and where land that is vacated by Palestinians, where Palestinians are forced to flee, that land, through different sets of mechanisms, later on can be and is often annexed for the expansion of settlements or other visible and invisible Israeli facts on the ground inside the West Bank and East Jerusalem. So I think, that just remembering that this is about land. Settler violence frightens people. Access restrictions squeeze the economy so that we can't stay on the land that we are traditionally and historically working on. So we have those two combinations. We have prevented access to land, and then the fear or actual violence, which again would stop us being able to carry out our traditional livelihoods and our social cultural traditions as well. So coming back all the time in our thinking to the bigger picture, remembering the international humanitarian law elements, so that we continue to push rather than only the operational messages, but we continue to push for the bigger message. Okay, I'll stop there and hand over to Ammar. And please, after Ammar's presentation, let's really, save your questions. I'm really happy to have a broader discussion. Thanks, Ammar.
Thank you, Nicola. Here I will try to present facts and figures, statistics about the olive harvest season in Palestine. Usually the season starts from late September up to early December. It's about 2.5 months, the all season. The timing is different from the northern part of the West Bank to the south, so there is a kind of differences in some cases about 1 to 2 weeks. Usually they start in the north, then in the south. So this is traditionally based on the Ministry of Agriculture in the Palestinian Authority that the olive harvest formally should start tomorrow, 10th of October. But we know that some farmers, they already start picking their olives because of the sensitivity, the security issues in different locations. So in general, I want here to try to analyze and explain why the olive harvest is important for the Palestinians. So in terms of the economical situation, actually the olive trees and the olive harvest season supporting about 100,000 households among all the West Bank. Their income or their main income resources is considered or depend on the olive trees here. Actually, it also represents about 55% of the agricultural land in the West Bank is planted with a tree with more than 8 million olive trees among all the West Bank. In general, also there's a different type of agricultural activities in the West Bank, but the olive tree actually contribute to about 25% of agricultural income. So it is very important for the Palestinians families, especially the poor farmers in the rural areas of the West Bank. Usually, and based on the context here, people are depending on the olive trees because actually it's long living, it's drought resistant. So you know about the climatic change and recurrent droughts that affecting the Mediterranean area and mainly here in the West Bank and Israel. So this type of tree actually is drought resistant and need minimum care. So compared with other agricultural activities. In terms of the social and cultural, actually, this season for the Palestinians is considered as like a festive season for family and their friends coming together from different generations, from children to young to elderly. Also, for the Palestinians, it's considered like a kind of symbolic to peace and resilience. It is also connect the people with their land among different generations. So because of that, it has a cultural or national symbolic value for them. In terms of the size of the olive harvest, actually, or the olive trees among the West Bank, there is about 600,000 dunums planted with olive trees among all the West Bank. Most of these lands actually is located in the northern part of the West Bank, starting from Tulkarem, Nablus, Salfit, and Ramallah. Then in the southwest bank, the number of or the size of trees here is less than the north of the West Bank, and the dependency on the olive trees as one of the main income in the southern West Bank is less than the northern part of the West Bank. Here I will try to provide a kind of analysis about the access restrictions and violations in 2023. Actually, in the West Bank now, we have almost about 800 movement or access obstacles or closures or checkpoints among all the West Bank. 86 of them were just created after October 7, 2023. These restrictions, obstacles or movement actually hindered Palestinians from access to their land, to their livelihood, and even to their houses in some areas like OHCHR in Hebron. So in the last year, actually, because of the war and the security situation, many of the Palestinians were unable to harvest their olive trees. About 20% of olive trees were not harvested by the Palestinian in 2023. We are talking here about 96.6 thousand of dunams of olive trees were not harvested among all the West Bank. Most of them actually located in Tul Karim, Nablus, and Ramallah governorate, because these areas are heavily dependent on olive tree as one of their main income for their economy situation. In the last year, also there was recorded or documented 113 olive or settler violence incidents related to olive harvest. So farmers were attacked by settlers among all of the West Bank. Actually, these incidents resulted in fatalities, injuries, and property damages for the Palestinian trees and vehicles who used to go to their field or to pick their olive from different areas. The incidents actually happened in different locations. It was not limited just to Area C, but mainly it happened in Area C, close to the settlements or the bypass roads in the West Bank. Here I will try to compare actually the situation between 2023 and 2024. In 2023, there was 1,151 settler incidents or violations against the Palestinians. The settlers were the perpetrators for these attacks. While in 2024, we have 1,647. So there is a high increase in terms of the settler violence in 2024 compared with 2023. It's the increase is about 40%. This is not include this all not limited to the quantitative calculations or quantitative data, but also to the severity of incidents. If you remember what happened in January, February in Hawara, in Nablus, and different locations like Turmus, Aya, and Sinjil. So we witness a kind of increase in terms of the severity of these incidents. I will come back to the olive harvest related incidents. So in 2023, there was 113 incidents were documented. We know that there is many incidents were not documented because the data or the access to the locations where incidents are usually occurred is not easy, and we depend on our partners or our connections with the community representative to provide us with the data related to settler violence to document these incidents. So, but compare this is with the 2024, we just want to start, or some of the farmers already started. Now we have 35 settler violence incidents happened in the West Bank. So this is a large or will explain to us that maybe the coming days we will see more and more settler violence during the olive harvest against the farmers. So I think the protective presence here will be one of the main elements that we can use in order to protect those farmers and to support them and to enable them pick their olive in the field. So your contributions and willingness to volunteer is very important and vital. And we, through a joint efforts with different partners, try to highlight the hotspot locations where we think that protective presence is vital and very important, because some communities used to face settler violence among all the year, while some families or some areas are just affected by settler violence during the olive harvest, because the agricultural land is located to settlements or illegal outposts or to bypass road among all the West Bank, and people try to avoid being there except in the olive harvest season. So we expect that the number of settler violence attacks against those farmers will be very high in the coming weeks. So we are looking for your support to provide this protective presence, and we will coordinate and try to facilitate for all the partners by highlighting the hotspot areas and try to collect information from the community representative, and even to document with your support or with the protective presence activist support to document the violations against the farmers and the volunteers who are supporting the olive harvest season. In terms of the incidents in the last year, actually, we can see that Nablus was the highest governorate who witnessed settler violence related to or during the olive harvest and related to olive harvest season. So we think that those governorate, starting from Nablus, Ramallah, Tul Karim, and then Hebron, and also Qalqilia, is the most affected areas with settler violence. So we will try to allocate resources in terms of protective presence to these governorates or to the rural areas of this governorate in order to support the farmer. So that's it from my side. I will open now, or we will open now for discussions, questions, comments from your side. So welcome.
Thank you very much, Ammar. And if you can stop sharing your screen, I'll put Nicola back up on Spotlight as well. And I suggest that people raise their hands either virtually or physically if they have a question that they'd like to ask you. And I'd like to get the ball rolling as well myself. So we saw. We were sent images and information about an attack that happened in Liban El Gharbia, which is in the Ramallah, west of the Ramallah, maybe somewhere in that area. And I wanted to ask you in terms of, because Nicola, you spoke of two responses: the response on the ground when something's happening, and the response after it happens. And so I just want to ask you about that incident. We saw an incident of settler violence towards harvesters. What are the steps that you take, the remedial, I think you called it, steps that you take after something like that happens? And can it help a community on the ground to go out again to harvest, but in safety?
Super, yeah, great question, Anton. Thank you. It's always a bit theoretical until we bring it down to a real example. And the Luban El Gharbia incident was a good example there. So in real time, I just want to add something to your question, but in real time, there is very limited, we are limited realistically. We have to be very clear about this in terms of our ability to intervene in real time. The communities have the Palestinian DCL, the coordinating liaison officer, phone numbers for the emergency line to the Palestinian authorities, who then coordinate with the IDF or the DCL through COGAT there. So the incidents are reported to the Israeli authorities. Now, does that trigger an IDF jeep or a unit being sent to the location? And the answer is sometimes yes and sometimes no. So in real time, we are limited, and it's very important not to raise expectations of communities and also of people who are providing protective presence on the ground during actual real-time violence. Now, remedial work for protection has many different types of activities. Some of that is the provision of mental health support. So people who request it, everybody will be offered following incidents, depending on the severity of the incident, with either mobile mental health services. There's 4 different levels of mental health support, ranging from community awareness and engagement all the way up to specific psychiatric support. So there's different layers there. Then in terms of building resilience, in terms of resisting violence in the future, of course, we know that when there are settlers who are armed, often escorted by IDF soldiers, however resilient we are as individuals doesn't really make much difference in terms of whether we are hurt or injured or not. What we can do is support, for example, in the case of the olive harvest, we can support farmers to have better equipment so that the olive harvest goes more quickly. We can support farmers to cut the grass around the olive trees short a couple of months before the harvest, if they can access the land, so that arson attacks will not then spread the fire into the olive groves. You know, there are these kind of agricultural preventative elements that we can try. Now, in terms of remedial, we also have case referrals. So there are certainly individual cases that are through our areas, what we call AORs, areas of responsibility. So that we have a GBV sector, we have a child protection specialist group. So there are case referrals for individual case follow-up as well. In terms of preventative, proactive protection, most of that occurs, I want to say, before violence. The fact is that most of these communities experience waves of violence. So we do work with communities, you know, during the lulls. So it's sort of preventative and remedial, if you like, because unfortunately, many communities are not new to this type of violence. We also, at the moment, are supporting the development of projects where communities that are more experienced in and more exposed to settler violence are trying to work on a project where they would be the trainers and they would travel around and be paid to support communities and share their experiences with communities who are less exposed or who have had less experience of violence. So it's about, you know, really depends on the type of community. In terms of the olive harvest, the preventative, you know, operational side is around agricultural ways to speed stuff up, as well as public advocacy to push the Israeli authorities to protect Palestinians, and that comes in the form of statements and private discussions, and then also to support community self-protection elements. For example, right now there's a discussion about a project where many Bedouin, for example, who are currently unable to go out to rangeland with their sheep because of the threat of violence, are having to stay also in the community because they don't want settlers to come in and attack the women and children whilst the men are out with the sheep. So they've lost their income due to the threat of violence. And therefore, how can we support them to replace the income whilst protecting the community? And in this case, we're talking through the beginning of designing a project where community men would be paid to stay up on a night shift basis to protect their community. Because as we all can imagine, if you know that settler violence may be imminent, you don't sleep well in a community that doesn't have houses and front doors with a lock. So, you know, this kind of projects, really trying to be flexible and adapt to the needs as they emerge. We're, you know, really trying to sort of encourage our partners to think outside the box and adapt to the new reality on the ground. I hope that's useful.
That's a really useful answer because of it being so multifaceted. And we really respect the work that the protection cluster is doing. I just shared that, you know, this is something that we experience a lot as well, that the protective presence, how do you tell when it's working is when the community says they feel safer. And we had activists 2 nights ago up in the northern Jordan Valley, and it's just a terrible piece of intimidation that for us is even worse as, you know, people with Jewish identity, to see settlers coming in with the ram's horn, the shofar, which is used at this time of year around Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, and to use it as a tool of intimidation and waking up children in the middle of the night and going into tents and homes, which is, you know, it's doubly perturbing what we're seeing on the ground, because it's also this mutation or this radicalization, religious radicalization of Jewish identity that's going hand in hand. But as you say, when the community says, you know, when you're here and you stay the night, the children don't sleep with their shoes on. That's a very strong statement. And we know that the places we're going to on the olive harvest, a lot of farmers are saying, if you're not coming, we're not going there. And we hope not to meet any violence at all, but that's one of the litmus tests when the community says, this is why the presence is needed. Ezra, I see you've got a question. And also anyone else can also raise their hand and jump into the conversation.
Yeah. Hi, Nicola. Hi, Ammar. Good to see you again. So a couple of days ago, we had trainings in Hebrew and also Arabic, and also English. Sorry, from the Human Rights Defenders Fund, who gave us a lot of context on the legal situation and what rights we should know about, and very like on the, you know, within our context, within our communal level, within the state level, what kind of materials we should be looking and how we should be looking for, and how to document them and what to do with them. I'm wondering if you could provide more of the context on a international level in terms of what kinds of documentation are generally effective, and how are they used, and how are sort of the powers that be taking this information and turning it into actionable things to help the situation.
Yeah, I'd be really happy to comment on that, Ezra, if that's Ammar, or maybe shall I start and then see if there's anything to add? But I think, you know, this is really, really useful for people who provide protective presence to know what they witness and what they then support the documentation of, to see how it travels. And, you know, I think as Anton was saying, you know, the presence, when it works well as a deterrent pre-violence, or at least that violence is witnessed, is immensely powerful to communities who are at threat. So feeling the support, feeling the witness, and constantly, I'm sure you've heard this, those of you who've been out and about in these communities, the main message is always tell our story. It's so often something that a community member will say as you're leaving, tell the story. And I think your role there in terms of being one of the lead protective presence organizations is absolutely crucial in terms of accurate reporting. So we come back to that diagram from earlier. So yes, we just to as a reminder, as the protection cluster, we create a set of tools for the olive harvest monitoring, and we have a leaflet that should go out later tonight, actually, with a link to the incident reporting form. So there's a sort of list of information that would be most helpful to be able to use a report to call for accountability through the various different channels that there are. So the form would ask for very specific information. Of course, the data is protected, and the victim or the potential victim is asked if they're happy for us to share their data or not in various different platforms. Now, the compilation of those incidents, and it depends on all sorts of moving pieces, but they are certainly compiled straight away, either into local statements or international statements on one-off incidents. You may remember recently there was a settler attack on a school in the Muarajat area for the Bedouin, which was severe and caused some great fear in the children. And therefore, UNICEF, who's head of the education cluster, and OHCHR and others, perhaps you guys as well, put out a statement straight away on the same day as a local statement to raise the alarm bells. Then there are other statements, if we're sticking on statements at the moment, so a short written document, which go all the way up, through the ranks of the different platforms of the international human rights system. And ultimately, the file that is compiled of violations or perceived violations either is fed into a system which requests investigations by the State of Israel onto violations, again, depending on the severity and depending on what they're asking for at the time. So investigations on the ground, or into the broader file of violations in the history, if you like, since the occupation began, which would be used and is used by the International Criminal Court and the bigger legal bodies working on the broader, so not just the local legal remedies, but using the international law system and the international human rights system. So the information is documented, all documents and all information coming in is checked through two different sources. Then the compilation of violations is used for, as I say, different types of statements. It's used in private advocacy almost straight away in terms of raising concerns about the violations taking place. And then it goes on through, if we're just talking about the UN system. Now, if we look at the INGO, the international NGO and the local NGO system, they also all have their platforms where this monitoring and reporting and documentation serves as the foundation for their advocacy. So pushing their own governments, pushing member states to take up their responsibility and their obligations as member states to push Israel to take up its obligations as an occupying power. So all the different actors involved on this stage have different mechanisms. And the UN one, as I said, is in that direction, but they all complement each other. And just as there's a cluster system, there's also an advocacy working group. So there's all different advocacy elements. Most organizations have an advocacy officer, and they will all be part of an advocacy working group that meets on a monthly basis, or at the moment on a bi-weekly basis, to share messaging and push it out in a coordinated way to have added strategic value.
Thanks, Nicola. That's really great. And we will be plugging into that UN system.
Yeah.
And it's important to note as well that some of the advocacy that we do is to the Israeli authorities. And we often send letters to the Attorney General and the Military Attorney General, sometimes directly to DCLs, but the Matak, as we call it in Hebrew, of the regional, because ultimately the Israeli army holds the responsibilities under Israeli law as well as international law to provide the safety and security for Palestinians. We should remember that in 2006, there was a Supreme Court decision that came about as part of a petition from rabbis of human rights in Palestinian communities, the Mu'ar decision, which lists the responsibilities of the army to allow Palestinian farmers to have access to their agricultural lands. And it really goes into it in great detail. And so this is something that needs to be added to that piece. So you're saying of the international picture, the Israeli authorities, and I think everyone on this call as well, who's based in the region, our work is also advocating to the army, to the government, we've seen a deep erosion of the rule of law in the West Bank, but that doesn't mean that the responsibilities have evaporated into thin air. They remain. And that needs to be continually reminded. Okay, let's open the floor. If anyone else would like to make a comment or a question, it's a good time to do it now. Okay, well, I think you've probably given such an in-depth.
I have a question. May I ask you a question?
Certainly, Tal.
Okay. Hi. I don't know how to word this in a way that I'm like fully comfortable, but given the presence of the military and good is bound to go on and bad is bound to go on, what are some neutral to positive interactions that take place during this time, during the harvest with the IDF and COGAT?
Hi, Tal. Thanks for the question. Just to check that I've understood, what are some of the positive interactions that take place with the Israeli authorities, the COGAT and the IDF during the harvest? So at the moment, we have to be really clear on this. At the moment, the UN has limited operational communication with either COGAT or the IDF in terms of protection issues in the West Bank. Since October 7 last year, the communication channels have been shut down on the Israeli side, and there is very limited ability to intervene in real time or to call for accountability on a regular basis with the authorities between the UN and the occupying power. Now, in all other conflict areas, this is a required, it's not an optional buy-in. It has to be established and agreed by both sides, and it is so. So in this case, currently, contrary to other years, in the past, I worked for 11 years from 2007 to 2018 in the West Bank, and part of my role there was on humanitarian dialogue for protection. And at that time, there were some really positive sort of build-up energetically of relationships there professionally, which allowed for the humanity of both sides to shine through. Currently, we are very, very limited in terms of UN dialogue on protection. There are some channels open, but now the focus, and it seems that COGAT is really pushing for the focus on protection intervention to be through the Palestinian DCL system. So in response, I think yesterday COGAT gave a briefing to some NGOs and diplomats. And in that briefing, in response to a request for a UN hotline for the olive harvest, the COGAT response was that the Palestinians can call the Palestinian DCL. Now, you all know as well as we do that the Palestinian DCL do not have authority in Area C. So whatever the advice is, that actually doesn't seem to work out on the ground, because for Area A and B, that may be very well, but for Area C, there's not really a channel there. So,
Nicola, really quick, can you explain what the DCL is?
Yeah, sorry, it's the liaison. So each, on the Israeli side, you have the, in COGAT, you have the external relations branch. And on that front, each governorate inside the West Bank, so you have a Ramallah DCL on both sides, on both the Palestinian and the Israeli sides. And the DCL is the district liaison C something, which I just can't remember right now, but it's an officer who is the district liaison officer for COGAT. So the external relations, they are in place to engage with the UN and other bodies on affairs connected to the occupation. So all matters connected, that may be access or protection or any other operational level interventions. So in the past, there have been very clear lines of communication set up, and it normally, if it wasn't post last October, we would expect calls regularly to be made by different UN bodies to the Israeli DCLs to report human rights, so settler attacks or other violations in real time, and for them normally to send an IDF unit to check out what's actually going on the ground. So at the moment, that function is missing. And Tal, to come back to your question, I'm I'm struggling to come up with any examples of the goodness at the moment because our communication has been cut off. So yeah, we are supporting very much in contact with the Palestinian DCL, which again is the liaison officers on these operational issues on the ground, who now are tasked with themselves calling, and this is a very old system, but themselves calling the Israeli side to alert them to some kind of attack or danger.
Sorry, can you hear me, Ilana?
Yeah.
Because my camera is on, but I can't see myself. Is it okay, or somebody else has to speak?
No, we can hear you.
Great, great.
Thank you to Nicola for everything, but I'd like to speak to ask Ammar if it's okay. كل الاحترام. I say in Arabic, all respect to you. But I was interested, as I'm not sure who you work for. I don't know how to call it. Do you have interaction with certain authorities? Do they menace you? I don't know the term to use. What kind of difficulties do you have as a Palestinian working in such work? I don't know if it's relevant to ask now.
First I want to say it's not easy for me as a Palestinian, for example, to travel, to access to different locations. So it's not allowed in many locations for all the Palestinians, regardless if I'm working with a UN agency. Actually, here in the West Bank, the main title for us to reach this is the Palestinian DCL. If there is any incidents happens, we used to call them, try to push them that they have to contact the Israeli party in order to intervene. In some cases, there is a response, but in other cases, they start asking more information, which we are unable to collect. For example, the GPS of the incidents. In some cases, it's not easy to have it in real time and to provide it in order to intervene. So they start asking about photos, movies. So this is one of the challenges that we are using to face as a Palestinians and as a staff of a UN agency when there is a need for us to intervene in certain locations and or in certain incidents. Hope this is clear for you, Ilana.
Thank you. I'd like one more sentence. After Ezra asked about what was a DCL, I don't know, I was thinking of an idea to make a list and send to emails of all these relevant, what do you call them?
Stakeholder.
Yeah,
Stakeholder.
and also with the Hebrew and Arabic, if that's even possible, for people who participate, because I usually don't remember all of these, whatever you call them, these letters. And thank you again. Thank you again, both of you, for the presentations.
Super. Maybe I could quickly add on that as well, that كل احترام, exactly, to our Palestinian colleagues, because recently the Israeli authorities have stopped giving visas to international staff for both the UN and the NGO community working in the West Bank. So there are very few international staff members left actually living there and able to move around. So when we look at proactive protection, what you're doing, preventative protection, including protective presence or protection by presence, Palestinian staff are much more at risk than international staff. And that is why we would always, really bulk up the international protective presence, because the Palestinian staff are at very high risk by providing that presence. And I think this is where your role comes in, because there is a layer of protection in some way, and I'm sure that you guys at Rabbis for Human Rights and the other organizations are much more eloquent about talking about this. But I think that, you know, really, really great admiration for our Palestinian colleagues who are putting themselves on the front line in terms of the risks that they take individually. And we very much try to make sure that they're not put right in the front line, but actually with the reduction in visas and the, you know, the very complicated situation on the ground, there is a very high risk to working in this field.
Thanks, Nicola. And I'll add that, you know, we have two key staff who are Palestinian working on this at Rabbis for Human Rights. The director of our Occupied Territories Department is Adam Rabia El-Horeini, and Samir, who is based in the Nablus region. And the truth of the matter is, without our Palestinian staff, it would be almost impossible to do the work that we're doing, because we have been coordinating the harvest since June, probably, maybe even a little bit before. And we're in touch with the communities year round. And you need to have Palestinians on the ground who are attuned to what is happening, much more than we as Jewish Israelis can be, no matter how often we visit. We're lucky to have Palestinian staff who are very well versed in protective presence, and not only look out for their own security, but look out for our security. And so we see that this kind of partnership of protective presence on the ground between, you know, Jews, internationals, and Palestinians it goes two ways. And yes, we are very concerned. Obviously, the most vulnerable group here are the Palestinian communities and Palestinians who are facing the military occupation. It's very difficult to find anything positive in a military occupation of a civilian population. It's going to be very difficult. And this year, especially when you know, in the past, there has been moments where the Israeli army have said on the olive harvest, we're coming and protect from settler violence on certain days in very hot spots. This year, we haven't seen that coordination happen or even begin to happen at all. And you might understand that the majority of Palestinians aren't really in a space where they trust the army to be reaching out and to be looking for that protection, because it's become very unclear who's a settler and who's a soldier since October 7th, and the Miloimnik, the reserve duty of the settlers, from putting on army uniform and sometimes giving orders on the ground. So it's a complex scenario, but it takes a lot of people and organizations to pull something together with this kind of intentionality. I want to thank you, Nicola and Ammar, for really an important presentation. I think it's important to we did a step back with Liam and looked at a global context, and we really did a zoom in on the West Bank now. The data that you give is, for us, crucial, and the knowledge that you bring and the ability to, you know, tap into something that's bigger than the work that we're doing as well. As far as was put up again, the sign-up form for the olive harvest, I'm pleased to say we've got trainings going on in Hebrew at the moment, and there was another 35 or 40 then. And as it's going, we're seeing people are signing up to take part in the harvest, which is exactly the idea of these sessions. So we hope to see everyone on the ground. The next session is going to start at 9 o'clock, and this is the main session of the security protocols and what's going to be happening during the olive harvest. For that, Danny Brodsky, who used to run our Occupied Territories Department and is an external consultant for us, is going to be presenting the security protocols that he helped design. And I hope that the people here will stay for that. I'll leave the Zoom open, and then we just restart again at 9, and probably there's some other people who joined up for it. If you're leaving us, thank you so much for joining. I can't thank you enough, Nicola and Ammar, for that session. I think everyone gained a lot from it. So thank you, and have a good evening.
Thanks so much, everybody. And likewise, you guys are a absolutely crucial part of all of it. So that's really super. All the best.
Thank you. Bye.
Hey, is the next session going to be on this link too?
Yes, the next session will be on the same Zoom link. So if you want to stay for it, you can just turn off the camera and come back in half an hour.
Thanks.
Welcome.